The coffee in his tin cup was still hot enough to burn his tongue when the first shot ripped through the Wyoming morning. It wasn't a hunting shot. You get to know the sounds out here in the Badlands. A hunter is patient, measured. This was something else. This was the sound of panic. Crack. Another one. Closer this time. Bouncing off the Red Canyon walls like a hateful echo. Jacob Morrison put his cup down. His hands, thick with calluses from years of ranch work, were steady. At 51, he'd learned that panic was a luxury you couldn't afford when you lived 100 miles from anything that looked like help. Crack, crack, crack. A volley. Rapid fire. Someone was running. Someone was chasing. And they were coming right for his front door. His old rifle was leaning right where it always was, by the cabin door. He snatched it up, the cool wood familiar in his grip, and scrambled onto the low roof of his cabin. From there, he could see the only way in or out of his little slice of nowhere, a narrow trail that snaked through the sandstone cliffs. For 6 years, this canyon had been his sanctuary, his escape. After the trial, after Helena, after the world had chewed him up and spat him out, this solitude was all he had left. He'd tended his small herd, listened to the wind, and tried to forget a world that had no place for him. But it looks like the world had finally found his hiding spot. A cloud of dust was rising from the trail, horses moving fast. Too fast. Jacob slid off the roof and took cover behind a knot of boulders near the path. The rock was cool against his cheek, a stark contrast to the frantic pounding in his chest. His instincts, honed by years wearing a badge and dulled by years of isolation, were screaming back to life. The first horse that rounded the bend was a pinto, its coat a mess of sweat and dirt. The rider was hunched low, a small figure clinging on for dear life. Even from a distance, Jacob could tell they were pushing the animal to its breaking point. Then came the chasers, 3 of them, big men on bigger horses, closing the distance with a grim, practiced ease. They weren't just chasing, they were toying with their prey. As the pinto galloped closer, the details snapped into focus, and a cold knot formed in Jacob's stomach. The rider was a young Native American girl, couldn't be more than 18. Her black hair streamed behind her, a stark banner against the red dust. Her buckskin dress was torn, and there was a dark stain of blood high on her shoulder. And the men behind her, they were white. They rode with rifles held loose, their faces twisted into masks of cruel enjoyment. This wasn't law enforcement. This wasn't justice. This was a blood sport. The girl's horse, its lungs screaming, finally stumbled on a patch of loose shale. It went down hard. The girl was thrown, rolling through the dirt and rocks, but she was on her feet in an instant, scrambling toward the only sign of shelter she could see. Jacob's cabin. Her pursuers were on her now. Jacob could hear their laughter, ugly and sharp, cutting through the air. He heard the vile things they were promising to do to her once they caught her. He had maybe 10 seconds to make a choice. He could stay hidden, let it happen. It wasn't his fight. He'd learned the hard way what happened when you stuck your neck out for other people. It gets chopped off. Solitude was safe. Solitude was smart. But then he saw her face, the sheer terror in her eyes as she ran, and he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that some lines, once crossed, you can never uncross. He stepped out from behind the rocks. The world seemed to stop. The girl froze, halfway to his cabin. The 3 men reined in their horses, their laughter dying in their throats. They stared at him, this ghost who had just appeared from the rocks, their expressions a mix of surprise and pure annoyance. Jacob raised his rifle, not aiming at them, but at the sky above. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of his rifle was like a thunderclap in the enclosed canyon. It was a sound that said, "The game is over." "That's far enough," Jacob called out, his voice rough from disuse but carrying clear in the thin air. "She's on my land, and she's under my protection." The leader, a big bearded man with a gut that spilled over his belt buckle, let out a barking laugh. Tobacco juice stained the corner of his mouth. "Protection? Mister, you don't know what you're protecting. That ain't a lady. That's a thief. A dirty Apache who stole from us. We're just getting back what's ours." The girl had reached Jacob now, standing just behind him. She was trembling, but her back was straight, her chin held high. Her dark eyes met Jacob's for a split second, and in them he saw not just gratitude, but a warning, a silent message that said, "These men are more dangerous than they look." "I don't see any stolen property," Jacob said, his rifle held steady, its barrel pointed at the ground between them. A neutral gesture for now. "I see three men chasing one scared girl, and it looks to me like you've been drinking your courage from a bottle this morning." A second man, lean and wiry, with cold, dead eyes like a snake, spat in the dust. "You got no idea what you're talking about, old man. That girl there, she killed a woman, a white woman, over in Laramie. We're bounty hunters. We're just bringing her to justice." "A killer?" Jacob glanced back at the girl. He'd seen killers in his time. He'd looked them in the eye, heard their lies. He looked into her eyes now and saw fear, exhaustion, and a deep, soul-crushing weariness. But he didn't see the mark of a murderer. He saw the look of someone who had been blamed for things her whole life, just for being who she was. "Bounty hunters, you say?" Jacob's voice was calm, conversational. "Then you won't mind showing me your badges? A warrant, maybe? Some kind of official paper?" The three men exchanged a look. It was a flicker of a glance, but it told Jacob everything he needed to know. The snake-eyed man's hand twitched, drifting down toward the pistol on his hip. These weren't lawmen. He'd been right. They were predators. "We don't need no damn badges to deal with her kind," the third man sneered. He was younger, with a cruel, handsome face, the kind of face that had never been punched hard enough. "And we sure as hell don't need permission from some crazy old hermit." A cold calm settled over Jacob. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in 6 years, but his body remembered it like an old friend. It was the feeling he used to get right before the shooting started. "You're on my property now," Jacob said, his voice dropping low. "And territorial law is very clear about what a man can do to protect his own land, and anyone he grants sanctuary on it." The big man laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "Sanctuary? Mister, you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life. There's three of us, one of you. Do the math." "The math's not as simple as you think," Jacob replied, and there was something in his tone now, a hard edge that made them all pause. "Before I came out here, I spent 15 years as a U.S. Marshal. I've seen my share of trouble, and I learned to tell the difference between men of the law and common trash." He let the words hang in the air. "You gentlemen," he said, his eyes locking with the leaders, "are trash." Suddenly the girl whispered something from behind him. It was in her own language, a tongue Jacob didn't understand, but the urgency was universal. She was warning him again. The snake-eyed man had heard enough. "Last chance, old man," he hissed, his hand closing around the butt of his pistol. "Get out of the way." Jacob didn't answer with words. He answered by working the lever on his rifle. The slick, metallic schlick-schlack of a fresh round, sliding into the chamber, was the only sound in the canyon. It was a sound that promised violence. "I have a different idea," Jacob said softly. "You and your friends turn your horses around and ride out of my canyon. You do it now, before I decide you're a threat that needs to be permanently removed." The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken threats. Jacob could see them calculating, weighing their chances. They were used to bullying and intimidation. They looked at this old man, standing alone in front of his shabby cabin, and they saw an easy target. But they were starting to feel a flicker of doubt. There was something in his eyes, a complete lack of fear, that was deeply unsettling. And that's when the girl, her voice trembling but clear, called out in perfect English. "They murdered my family, Reesh!" she cried, the words echoing off the rock. "3 days ago, they killed my father, my mother, and my little brother. They burned our camp to the ground. For sport." Her words struck Jacob like a punch to the gut. The truth, raw and horrible, was laid bare. These men weren't bounty hunters. They weren't avenging a crime. They were tying up a loose end. She was the only witness. The leader's face turned purple with rage. "Shut your mouth, you lying squaw." "Truth has a funny way of coming out," Jacob said, his voice dangerously quiet, "especially when it's been drowned in innocent blood." "Innocent?" the handsome one scoffed. There's no such thing as an innocent Indian. They're savages. We're just finishing the job the government's too scared to do. The standoff was at a breaking point. 3 guns against 1. But Jacob had the terrain, he had the cover, and more importantly, he had the cold, hard certainty that he was on the right side of God's law, if not man's. The snake-eyed man finally broke. His hand blurred as he drew his pistol. He was fast, but Jacob was faster. Jacob's rifle bucked against his shoulder. The shot was deafening. The snake-eyed man screamed, a high, thin sound, and tumbled from his saddle, his hand clutching a shoulder that was suddenly a red ruin of shattered bone and torn cloth. The other 2, cursing in shock and fury, spurred their horses forward. But the narrow trail was their enemy. They couldn't spread out. They were a perfect target. Jacob worked the lever again, smooth and practiced. Schlick-schlack. The second shot wasn't aimed to kill. It was a message. It slammed into the canyon wall right next to the handsome man's head, spraying his face with chips of rock and dust, drawing blood from a dozen tiny cuts. "The next one won't miss," Jacob called out. The big leader pulled his horse to a stop, his face a mask of disbelief and frustrated rage. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The old hermit was supposed to cower. He was supposed to beg. He wasn't supposed to fight back like a cornered wolf. "This ain't over, old man," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "We know where you live now. We'll be back. We'll bring more men, and we'll burn this whole damn canyon to the ground." "You're welcome to try," Jacob said, and the calmness in his voice was more terrifying than any threat. "But I should probably mention, the reason I was a marshal for 15 years is because I was real good at one thing. Killing men who needed killing." He took a step forward. "And it's a skill you never really forget." The threat hung in the air, as real and solid as the boulders around them. The leader looked at his friend, moaning and bleeding in the dirt. He looked at the unmoving barrel of Jacob's rifle. He looked at the old man's eyes, and he saw no bluff there. He saw only a promise. Sense, finally, won out over pride. The leader dismounted, helped his wounded companion back onto his horse, and shot one last glare of pure hatred at Jacob. "This is not finished," he snarled. "Oh, yes, it is," Jacob replied softly. "It finished the moment you murdered a family. Everything that happens now, this is just the bill coming due." They rode away, leaving their wounded man slumped in the saddle. Jacob watched them go, rifle still at his shoulder, until they were just a dust cloud in the distance. He waited another 10 minutes, listening to the silence of the canyon return, before he finally allowed himself to lower the weapon. Only then did he turn to the girl. She stood by the cabin door, no longer the terrified fugitive, but someone transformed. The fear was still there, deep in her eyes, but it was overshadowed by a quiet strength, a fierce dignity. Up close, he could see the elegant lines of her face, the intelligence in her gaze. "Thank you," she said. The 2 words were heavy with a meaning that went far beyond simple gratitude. "What's your name?" Jacob asked, his voice still hoarse. "Ayana," she said. "It means eternal blossom." She gave a small, sad smile. "Though today I feel more like a trampled weed." "You're Apache?" "Mescalero," she confirmed. My father was Chief Standing Bear." The word "was" caught in her throat, a tiny crack in her composure. "Those men, they wanted our horses. They decided it would be easier to take them if there was no one left to object." Jacob felt that old familiar rage building in his chest, the same righteous fire that had made him pin on a badge all those years ago. The world was full of predators. He'd just forgotten that for a while. "How did you escape?" "I was at the stream, gathering water," she said, her voice becoming flat, distant, as if she were reciting a story about someone else. "I heard the shots. I hid. When I came back—" She trailed off, her eyes seeing a horror that Jacob could only imagine. "They've been hunting me for 3 days. I am the only one who saw their faces, the only one who can tell the world what they did." Jacob's blood ran cold. She wasn't just a witness, she was the only witness. That made her the most dangerous person in the world to those men, and they knew exactly where she was. "They'll be back," Ayana said, reading his thoughts. "Men like that can't afford to leave a witness, and they won't forgive being made to look like fools." Jacob nodded grimly. You can't stay here. When they come back, it won't be just 3 of them. They'll bring an army. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He'd saved her, only to tell her she had to run again. I know, she said. I never meant to bring this war to your doorstep. She looked at him, her gaze direct. If you could lend me a horse, I will ride for the territorial capital. I will find the governor. I will make him listen. It was a brave plan. It was also suicide. She was exhausted, injured, and alone. Those men, or whoever they worked for, would be watching every road, every pass. She wouldn't make it 10 miles. An idea began to form in Jacob's mind. A dangerous, crazy idea. There's another way, he said slowly. Your father was Chief Standing Bear. His murder won't be ignored by the other tribes. Not if they find out what really happened. Ayana's eyes widened as she understood. You are suggesting I tell the other chiefs? I'm suggesting, Jacob said, choosing his words with care, that official justice can be slow. Sometimes you need to apply a different kind of pressure. It was a terrifying gamble. Uniting the Apache bands over the murder of a chief could ignite a fire that would burn the whole territory to the ground. It could start a war, but it might be the only way to get justice for Ayana's family, and it might be the only way to keep her alive. There is a place, Ayana said, her voice filled with a new dawning hope. A sacred valley in the mountains. The chiefs meet there when a great matter must be decided. If I could reach it, if I could speak to them. How far? 2 days' ride, maybe 3 if we avoid the main trails. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. But I cannot get there alone. They will be waiting. Jacob stood at a crossroads. Again, 6 years of peace and quiet. 6 years of minding his own business. He could give her a horse, point her north, and wash his hands of it. He could go back to his coffee and his solitude. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw the flicker of hope he had just lit, and he knew he couldn't be the one to snuff it out. He remembered the trial, remembered how he'd stood alone then, too. He'd lost everything for trying to do the right thing once before. Was he really willing to risk what little he had left? The answer, it turned out, was yes. I know a way through the mountains, he said, the decision settling in his bones. Old trails, hidden passes. They'll never find us. Ayana stared at him, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. You would do this? You would help me? I'll do more than that, Jacob said, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. I'll go with you. I'll stand before your chiefs and I'll add my voice to yours. They might not listen to an Apache girl, but they might listen to a former U.S. Marshal who saw the bodies with his own eyes. Wait. He hadn't told her that part yet. He hadn't told her anything. She looked at him, a strange expression on her face. You saw the bodies? Jacob froze, a slip of the tongue. He'd been so caught up in the plan, he'd said too much. He hadn't seen anything. He'd just assumed. No, he corrected himself quickly. I mean, I would tell them what I saw here, how those men were acting, that they were murderers, not lawmen. Ayana's eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of something, suspicion, disappointment, passed through them before it was gone. She was exhausted, terrified, and a stranger had just saved her life. She had no reason to doubt him. Did she? You would risk your life, she said quietly, for a people you do not know. Jacob thought of Helena. He thought of the courtroom, the lies, the way his whole life had been burned to the ground because he'd stood up for someone nobody else would. Let's just say, he answered, his voice tight, I have an old debt to pay. To justice. They spent the day preparing. Jacob packed jerky, hardtack, and ammunition. Ayana, her own wound crudely bandaged, tended to his spare horse, a steady mare named Belle. As they worked, an uneasy silence grew between them. The slip of his tongue had changed something. A thread of doubt had been woven into their fragile alliance. Jacob tried to ignore it. He was doing the right thing. That's all that mattered. But as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the canyon, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He scanned the rim of the canyon walls, his eyes tracing every rock, every shadow. Nothing. Just the wind and the hawks circling high above. It had to be his nerves. The memories of the morning, the prospect of the journey ahead, it was enough to make any man jumpy. That night they took turns sleeping. Iana rested inside the cabin while Jacob sat on the porch, his rifle across his lap, watching the trail. The moon was a silver sliver in the sky, offering little light. The canyon was filled with a deep, profound darkness. Around midnight, he heard it, a single pebble, dislodged, skittering down the canyon wall to his left. It wasn't the wind. He stood up slowly, melting into the deeper shadows against the cabin wall. His heart was a cold, hard lump in his chest. He strained his ears, listening for a footstep. The creak of leather, the whisper of cloth against rock. Nothing. 10 minutes passed. 20. He started to think he'd imagined it. And then he saw him. A figure moving like a shadow among shadows, creeping toward the small corral where the horses were kept. It was the young one, the handsome one with the cruel mouth. He'd come back alone, trying to be a hero, no doubt, to steal their horses and leave them stranded, to finish the job his friends had failed to do. Jacob smiled grimly in the darkness. The boy was cocky. He thought the old man would be asleep, that the girl would be helpless. He was wrong. He let the boy get closer. Let him get to the fence of the corral. Let him start to unlatch the gate. Then Jacob raised his rifle, took a steady aim at the ground just in front of the boy's feet, and fired. The explosion of the gunshot was followed by the whiz of the bullet kicking up dirt, and a startled yelp from the boy. He dove for cover, firing his pistol wildly into the darkness. Bullets splintered the wood of the cabin porch, inches from where Jacob had been sitting. Inside, Iana screamed. "Stay down!" Jacob yelled. He fired again, not at the boy, but at the rocks above him, sending a shower of stone chips raining down. The handsome boy was panicking now. His sneak attack had failed. He was pinned down, alone, and he had no idea where Jacob was. He fired 2 more shots, then scrambled backward, crab walking into the darkness, and disappeared. Jacob waited, his breath held tight in his chest. A minute passed. Then another. He heard the sound of a horse galloping away at full speed. He was gone. The cabin door creaked open. Ayana stood there, a silhouette against the lantern light inside. "Is he—" "He's gone," Jacob said, walking back to the porch. His hands were shaking slightly. He wasn't as young as he used to be. "But he knows we're planning on going somewhere. He was after the horses. They'll be watching the trails for sure now." He looked at Ayana. In the faint light, he could see something new in her eyes. The suspicion was gone. In its place was a hard-earned respect. He had protected her again. He had proven himself. "We leave at first light," he said. But the dawn brought a new kind of terror. It wasn't the sound of one horse. It was the sound of hundreds. A low, rhythmic thunder that grew louder and louder, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Jacob scrambled back onto the roof, his heart sinking with every beat. He expected to see the bounty hunters, an army of them, come to burn him out. What he saw was far worse, and far more complicated. A river of riders was pouring into his canyon. But they weren't white men. They were Apache, hundreds of them. Warriors painted for war, carrying rifles and lances that glinted in the rising sun. They moved with a silent, deadly precision that made the 3 bounty hunters look like clumsy children. At their head rode a man who radiated authority. His face was a mask of weathered granite, his hair adorned with eagle feathers. This was no mere war party. This was a gathering of chiefs, an army. Jacob felt the world tilting under his feet. He slid down from the roof and found Ayana in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. "Do you know them?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The banner," she breathed, pointing. "The one with the black eagle. It belongs to my uncle, War Eagle. He is the war chief of the Northern Mescalero." She looked at the other riders, the men from a dozen different bands. "But the others, I do not know them. Word has spread. The murder of my father, it has united them. It wasn't a rescue party, it was a council of war. And Jacob's tiny, isolated ranch was about to become the epicenter of a conflict that could tear the whole territory apart." The riders fanned out, surrounding the cabin in a silent, menacing circle. 200 warriors, their dark eyes fixed on the lone white man and the Apache girl. The air was electric with tension. A single wrong move, a single wrong word, and blood would soak the dry Wyoming soil. War Eagle dismounted and walked forward alone. His eyes were hard, ancient things that seemed to look right through Jacob, weighing his soul. He stopped a few yards away and began to speak to Ayanna in their native tongue. It was a rapid, emotional exchange of grief and relief. Finally, the war chief turned his gaze to Jacob. He spoke in English, his voice a low growl. "You are the man who saved my niece." It wasn't a question. "I helped her," Jacob said, his own voice steady. "She tells me you fought 3 men, that you killed one of them." Jacob's eyes darted to Ayanna. Killed one? He'd shot the man in the shoulder. A disabling shot, not a fatal one. Why would she say that? Was it a test? Or did she believe it to be true in the chaos? He decided to let it lie. A dead enemy was a more impressive feat than a wounded one. It made him seem more formidable. "I did what was necessary," he said. War Eagle nodded slowly. "These are not the actions of an enemy. But my niece also tells me you spoke of seeing the bodies of her family, a thing you could not have done." The accusation hung in the air, cold and sharp as a knife. Every warrior was watching him, waiting. This was the real test. Jacob met the chief's gaze without flinching. Lying now would be suicide. It was a slip of the tongue. In my years as a marshal, I saw the aftermath of too many attacks like the one she described. For a moment, it felt as if I had been there. I apologized for the mistake. War Eagle studied his face for a long time. Jacob could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on him. He could feel his life hanging by the thread of this one man's judgment. Then, from the ranks of the warriors, another man stepped forward. He was younger than War Eagle, his face a mask of rage and impatience. His war paint was fresh, a stark slash of black and red across his cheeks. "Uncle," the man spat, pointing a finger at Jacob, "you would parley with this white-eye? He lies, they all lie. He probably led the killers here himself. We should burn his cabin and take the girl." "Be silent, Stoneheart," War Eagle commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. He did not take his eyes off Jacob. "My niece trusts this man. For now, that is enough." He turned back to Jacob. "Why did you help her? Tell me the real reason, not some story about justice." Jacob thought for a moment. What could he say that this man would believe? He looked past War Eagle, at Ayanna's face. He remembered the terror, the desperation, and he remembered the moment he chose to step out from behind the rocks. "Because I was a coward for 6 years," Jacob said, the truth finally coming out, raw and painful. "I ran from the world because it hurt me. I hid in this canyon and told myself I was free. But I was just afraid. When I saw those men chasing her, I saw them for what they were. Bullies, predators. And I knew that if I stayed hidden, if I let them take her, then the man I used to be would be dead forever. I didn't save her to be a hero. I did it to save myself." The silence that followed was absolute. Ayanna stared at him, her eyes shining with a new understanding. Even the furious Stoneheart seemed taken aback by the raw honesty of the confession. War Eagle nodded slowly, a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. "A man who knows his own heart is a man who can be trusted." He paused. "But trust is not enough. My niece is the daughter of a great chief. She is now without a father, without a brother to protect her honor. This is a matter of great weight among our people." Jacob felt a cold premonition creep up his spine. He knew enough about native customs to know where this was going. "According to our laws," War Eagle continued, his voice taking on a formal, ceremonial tone, "when a man saves the life of a high-born woman, a bond is created, an obligation." "What kind of obligation?" Jacob asked, his mouth suddenly dry. "The kind that joins 2 people. The kind that joins 2 families." War Eagle's gaze was like a physical force. "My niece has no one to speak for her. That duty now falls to me, and I say that to protect her honor, to secure her place among her people, and to forge an alliance between us, she must become your wife." The world stopped spinning. Wife? He was suggesting marriage? To this girl he had just met? It was insane. It was a political maneuver, a way to bind him to their cause, to ensure his testimony. But then he looked at Ayanna. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. She was not a pawn in her uncle's game. She had a strength that was all her own. "What does Ayanna say?" Jacob asked, his voice hoarse. War Eagle spoke to her in Apache. She listened, then replied, her voice soft but firm. "She says you are a man of honor," War Eagle translated. "She says you have a strong heart, even if it is a broken one. She says she would be proud to be your wife." Jacob's mind was reeling. A wife, a family, an alliance that could either bring peace or start a war. Stoneheart was now openly sneering, disgusted by the turn of events. He saw it as a weakness, a betrayal of their people. This wasn't just a proposal. It was a choice between two futures. War Eagle's path of cautious alliance, or Stoneheart's path of all-out war. And Jacob was standing right in the middle of it. He looked at the 200 warriors. He looked at the angry face of Stoneheart. He looked at the wise, calculating eyes of War Eagle. And finally he looked at Ayanna. He saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of hope. She was trusting him, not just with her life, but with her future. 6 years of running, 6 years of hiding. It was over. "I accept," Jacob said, his voice clear and strong. The ceremony was short, a mixture of Apache tradition and words Jacob recognized from the Bible. Spoken by War Eagle. 200 silent warriors stood as witnesses. When it was over, Jacob Morrison, the hermit, the exile, was a married man. His life was no longer his own. As the war party prepared to leave, War Eagle pulled Jacob aside. "Stoneheart does not approve of this," he warned. "He believes the only answer to white violence is Apache violence. He will be watching you. Do not give him a reason to doubt this choice." Then came the next shock. "We will not ride to the Sacred Valley," War Eagle announced. "The chiefs are already gathering. My niece's testimony is too important to risk on such a journey. Instead, you will take her to the territorial capital. You, a white man, a former marshal, will speak for her to your own leaders. That will carry more weight than 1,000 Apache warriors." It was a brilliant move, and a terrifying one. The capital was crawling with men loyal to the powerful ranchers and politicians who ran the territory. The men who had killed Ayanna's family weren't just random thugs. They were part of something bigger. "But what about justice for my family?" Ayanna asked, her voice tight with anguish. "Justice will come," War Eagle said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But it will be a white man's justice, served in a white man's court. We will see if their laws are worth the paper they are written on." He turned to Jacob. "I will give you 5 of my best warriors as an escort, but the journey is yours to make." He then pointed to Stoneheart. "And he will go with you, to ensure my niece's safety." It was a trap, a test. War Eagle was sending his most vocal opponent along, a man who would be looking for any excuse to prove the alliance was a mistake. Jacob was being sent into the lion's den, with a wolf watching his back. The journey was a nightmare. They rode hard, avoiding the main roads, sleeping in short, nervous shifts. Stoneheart and his warriors were a constant, brooding presence. They did not speak to Jacob. They watched his every move, their contempt obvious. On the second day, they found the tracks. 3 riders, the ones from the canyon. But they weren't alone. They had been joined by at least a dozen more men. They weren't bounty hunters anymore. They were a small army, and they were hunting them. The chase was on. For a day and a night, they rode through the treacherous mountain terrain, the hunters always just behind them. They were being expertly tracked, led into a trap. And Jacob finally understood why. Stoneheart. He wasn't just watching, he was leaving a trail, a subtle sign here, a broken branch there. He was leading the killers right to them. He wanted a confrontation. He wanted to prove to War Eagle that fighting was the only way. He wanted Jacob to fail, to die, so he could take Ayanna and start his war. As dusk fell on the 3rd day, they found themselves cornered in a narrow box canyon, eerily similar to Jacob's own. The only way out was the way they came in, and blocking that path was the bearded leader, the handsome boy, and an army of hired guns. "Now we will see the heart of the white man," Stoneheart hissed, a triumphant gleam in his eye. He and his warriors drew their weapons, ready for a final, glorious battle. But Jacob had one last card to play. He turned to Stoneheart, his face grim. "Your uncle didn't send you to start a war," he said, his voice low and urgent. "He sent you to see if I was a man of my word. If this alliance was real, if you fight them now, you prove him wrong. We all die, and Ayana's story dies with us. There will be no justice, only blood." He turned to Ayana. "He's right," she said to Stoneheart in Apache. "Vengeance is not justice. My father believed in peace. Honor his memory. Honor your chief." The hired guns were advancing now, spreading out, taking aim. In a few seconds, the canyon would erupt in a storm of lead. Stoneheart was torn. His hatred for the white men warred with his duty to his chief and his loyalty to Ayana's family. "What then, Marshal?" he sneered. "Do we surrender?" "No," Jacob said, a strange, sad smile on his face. "We do what I should have done 6 years ago." He stepped out into the open, his hands raised high. "Hold your fire," he yelled. "I want to talk to your boss." The bearded man laughed. "Our boss ain't here, old man, and we ain't in a talking mood." "Oh, I think he'll want to talk to me," Jacob called back. "Tell him Jacob Morrison is here. Tell him I know all about Helena." The name hit the bearded man like a physical blow. His face went white. He barked an order to one of his men, who quickly galloped away. The rest of them waited, their rifles still aimed, but their confidence shaken. Minutes later, a new rider appeared. A man in a fine suit, riding a magnificent black horse. He was older, with a clean-shaven, handsome face that was spoiled by a cruel twist to his lips. He stared at Jacob, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Morrison, I heard you were dead." "Not dead, Blackwood," Jacob said, his voice cold as ice. "Just hiding." He looked at Ayana, then back at the man on the horse. "It seems you and I have a bad habit of getting tangled up with the same kind of people." Land Baron Alistair Blackwood, the man who had framed Jacob 6 years ago, the man who had bribed witnesses and destroyed his reputation, the man whose young wife Helena, Jacob had tried to protect from his abuse. The trial had been a sham. Jacob was ruined, and Helena had been found dead a month later, a supposed suicide. It all clicked into place. This wasn't just about Apache land. Blackwood was expanding his empire. He'd had Chief Standing Bear murdered, and he'd hired the same kind of thugs who had worked for him years ago. "You won't get away with this, Blackwood," Jacob said. "Not again." Blackwood smiled, a chilling, empty gesture. "Again? My dear Jacob, I already have. You have a dozen rifles pointed at you. You have a hostile Apache warrior at your back who is dying to start a war. You have nothing." "I have a witness," Jacob said, nodding toward Ayana. "A witness nobody will believe," Blackwood sneered. "And I have another one," Jacob said. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "Helena's diary. She gave it to me before the trial. It details every beating, every threat, everything you did to her. I was supposed to enter it as evidence, but it disappeared from my hotel room the night before, or so I thought." He looked over at Ayana. "Turns out I'd given it to a friend for safekeeping, a friend who sent it to me a few weeks ago. I've been sitting in my canyon, trying to decide what to do with it, wondering if the world even cared about justice anymore." He held up the diary. "This book will not only prove you murdered your wife, it will establish a pattern. It will make Ayana's story undeniable. Your empire, Blackwood, is built on a foundation of graves, and I'm about to bring the whole thing crashing down." Blackwood's face was a mask of pure fury. "Kill them!" he screamed. "Kill them all!" But as his men raised their rifles, Stoneheart let out a war cry. He and his warriors opened fire, not at Jacob, but at Blackwood's men. The canyon exploded into chaos. Jacob shoved Ayana behind a rock and started firing, the old marshal reborn. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Blackwood's hired guns were mercenaries, not warriors. They were caught completely by surprise, pinned between Jacob's deadly accuracy and the ferocious, coordinated attack of the Apache. In less than a minute, it was over. The survivors fled. Only Blackwood remained, his horse shot out from under him, a pistol in his hand. He aimed at Ayanna. Jacob fired first. The shot was perfect. Blackwood dropped his pistol, clutching a shattered wrist, his face a mask of agony and defeat. Silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the moans of the wounded. Stoneheart walked over to Jacob, his face unreadable. He looked at the carnage, at Blackwood writhing on the ground. He looked at Ayanna, safe and unharmed. The war chief was right, he said, his voice filled with a grudging respect. Your way was better. The journey to the capital was different after that. There was no more suspicion. They rode as allies. When they arrived, Jacob Morrison, the disgraced marshal, walked into the governor's office with the daughter of an Apache chief, a respected Apache war chief, and the personal diary of a murderer. Alistair Blackwood's empire crumbled. His crimes, both old and new, were exposed. The story of the lone rancher and the Apache princess became a legend in the territory, a symbol of hope that justice was possible, that two different peoples could find common ground. Jacob never went back to his canyon. He and Ayanna stayed at the capital working with War Eagle to draft new treaties to protect the Apache lands that Blackwood had tried to steal. They built a new life, a bridge between two worlds, forged in blood and fire. They proved that even in the darkest of places, a single act of courage can change everything. That one man, choosing to step out from behind the rocks, can save more than just one life. He can save the soul of a nation, and he can save his own. What a ride, right? It just goes to show you that sometimes the quietest people have the loudest stories to tell. The world is full of bullies like Alistair Blackwood, but it's also full of heroes like Jacob and Ayanna. What do you think? Did Jacob make the right choice in the end? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of forgotten history and incredible courage, do me a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.